Jim is a senior writer and editor at the U.S. Institute for Peace. Before joining the Institute, Jim was a foreign affairs correspondent and has reported from more than 70 countries for the Washington Post, Newsday, Bloomberg News, and has served as foreign affairs editor at the Post and Newsday. Over his 30-year journalism career, Jim served as resident correspondent in Morocco, Tunisia, France, India, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, Cote d'Ivoire, and Pakistan. His coverage focused heavily on South and Central Asia, the Arab and Islamic worlds, the former Soviet Union, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Jim is a former Alicia Patterson Fellow and Michigan Journalism Fellow. Before joining the Institute in 2015, he served as a writer at the Atlantic Council and editor of its Ukraine Alert newsletter. I think Ukraine has been in the news lately. I think I've heard about it, yeah. Jim graduated from Swarthmore College in 1979 and served as a Peace Corps volunteer, building and teaching at a vocational school in Morocco. Would you please give Jim a warm welcome?
Thank you so much. The one thing Peter didn't confess is that before I did any of those things, I went to college with him.
Which, remarkably, you left out of your official biography on the website. I don't understand that.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you all for the invitation to come and join you. Just to talk about justice, which is the theme that you all have raised, and its intersection with the notion of peace, which is the mission of the institution within which I work. Having been introduced, I will say, to St. John's only through my preparation for this conversation this morning, and also through the service that we've just had now. I'll say that in my own wanderings through religious communities, which started, I'm a Methodist preacher's kid, and have over the wound up as did Peter, wound up going to a Quaker college and hanging out at different times with the Quakers and the Unitarians and the Muslims and so forth. I've come to the conclusion that our religious communities, our religious congregations are dying when they ask the question, how do we get people in the door? Which is what a lot of church congregations ask. It's the conversation in the room. And that our religious communities are thriving when they instead ask the question, how can we best serve? And it's very clear in just a brief introduction to St. John's that it is the latter question that motivates this community. And it's impressive to see, and it makes me the more grateful for your invitation to come. On the topic of the moment, Peter mentioned that the bulk of my career has been as a foreign correspondent, and too much of that time, I will say, has been spent as a war correspondent, starting with the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s, and then the wars of the 1990s that accompanied the collapse of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, and the brutal atrocities of Liberia, Sierra Leone, the Democratic, as it is pleased to call itself, Republic of Congo, the former Zaire, and too many other places. Those experiences as a reporter make me grateful now to be able to spend a few years of my career working within the American National Institution that is specialized on the mission of preventing and avoiding warfare, and that is the U.S. Institute of Peace. Most most Americans are not actually aware that we have a U.S. Institute of Peace. So I should perhaps give it a bit of an introduction. The Institute was founded by Congress to strengthen America's ability to prevent and resolve violent conflict overseas. It's a young institution, just 35 years old, but it is grounded in an idea as old as, in fact, arguably older than the Republic. The idea that the United States' chosen form of government, democracy, is particularly well adapted to avoiding and preventing wars, which of course at the time of the revolution, warfare was seen as the ill, the vice of autocratic rulers who felt no and wanted no constraint on their power. And over our founding history includes, in fact, before the Republic even started, and this is a bit of our history that we need to do a better job of digging out. We bear a responsibility to do it, in fact. It's the role played in our nation's gestation by notions of Native American governance, notably that of the Iroquois Confederacy of what's now the northeastern United States, which was governed by a constitution known as, among the Iroquois, the 6 Iroquois nations, known as the Great Law of Peace. We know that the principles of the Iroquois Constitution were among the ideas that were discussed by the founders of the American Republic, the guiding principle of that Confederacy and its Constitution being ruled by consensus, not by majority rule. Then in the earliest days of the United States, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Rush of Philadelphia, collaborated with Benjamin Banneker, our nation's first African-American astronomer, mathematician, to publish in 1793 a proposal that the government of the United States should include a federal office of peace, or a federal Department of Peace. And let me read a couple of lines from this proposal. Their proposal, the published proposal said, "Let a Secretary of the Peace be appointed to preside in this office, who shall be perfectly free from all the present absurd and vulgar European prejudices upon the subject of government. Let him be a genuine Republican and a sincere Christian, for the principles of republicanism and Christianity are no less friendly to universal and perpetual peace than they are to universal and equal liberty." And what was to be the first responsibility of the proposed federal Secretary of Peace? It was to be this: let a power be given to this Secretary to establish and maintain free schools in every city, village, and township of the United States. A conviction there in the first decade of our country's existence, that peace relied, first of all, on our ability to educate ourselves. That proposal obviously was not, did not make it into the Constitution, which was at that very moment being debated and ratified. But still, for 200 years, the American political conversation has always had this thread in it that suggested that our nation has a particular vocation in the world of promoting peace and avoiding war. And this has been a pretty diverse set of, actually I called it a thread, it's actually a series of threads. It has come, perhaps a bit more from what we might notionally call the political left, but also has arisen on the political right. It has included secular movements, religious movements. It's been geographically diverse. Some of these movements, of course, these movements they rise and they fall. They've arisen particularly, as we might expect, in response to American engagements in wars. And they were strong enough at the start of the last century for example, to impel Teddy Roosevelt as president to place a new, at that time, unprecedented emphasis on mediation and arbitration as a way of resolving international disputes, as opposed to a simple, immediate reliance on warfare. He mediates an end to the Russo-Japanese War, enforces arbitration in other international disputes, and pretty soon we have Woodrow Wilson pressed again from grassroots movements to become the architect of the League of Nations. Those grassroots movements don't succeed in achieving the Senate ratification of that treaty, but then, of course, the whole process gets restarted after World War II and the founding of the United Nations. So it's a long thread upon which ultimately the founding of the U.S. Institute of Peace built. From 1932 to about 1980, there were no fewer than 140 bills introduced in Congress for some kind of national peacemaking, peace-building institution, be it either proposals for a federal Department of Peace, which still are being made, still being introduced in Congress on a regular basis, or for a national, say, peace academy, which is the specific proposal that led to the creation of the Institute. Most Americans are unaware, of course, that the Institute even exists, but when they learn of it, they often suppose that it surely must be an outgrowth of, well, the Institute of Peace. It must be, these must be aging hippies. This must be something that sprang from the countercultural, the counterculture of the New Left during the Vietnam War era. Not so. In the end, the United States now has an Institute of Peace because its creation was led and enforced by those Americans of their generation who best understood the costs of war. And these were combat veterans of World War II. It was they who led the creation of the U.S. Institute of Peace. One of them lived here in Bethesda. It was a man named Michael Mapes, who had been a Navy officer in World War II and who, in later life, came to lead something called the National Peace Academy campaign. The notion was that a nation with a vast and powerful military fed by no fewer than 4 national military academies at West Point and Annapolis and so forth, that such a nation should be able to manage, and indeed should manage, to have a national academy for peace building, and ultimately that campaign was taken up in Congress, particularly by 2 men who, during World War II, had by the 1980s they both held the exalted title of senator, but during World War II had held the grittier title of lieutenant. One was a Republican, Mark Hatfield of Oregon, who had served as a Navy lieutenant during World War II, and his job had been to command landing craft, which hauled Marines onto the beaches of Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and then, under fire, of course, and then hauled the wounded and the dead back to the Navy ships. But Hatfield's, the assignment that really changed Hatfield's life it was his very last assignment of World War II, when he was ordered to sail his craft into a Japanese port city called Hiroshima, and to become the first American to survey what happens when we drop a nuclear bomb on a living city. He conducted the first military survey of the destruction of Hiroshima, tied up his landing craft at a dock, discovered a handful of Japanese folks, he said basically dressed in rags and clearly starving, who came down to the dock to see this curiosity of an American ship, and who got off to now take a look around in fulfillment of his orders. And lo and behold, this young Japanese man shows up on a working bicycle and gives him a ride. And as Hatfield later wrote, you know, he had been trained to see these people as enemies, and as really something a little less than human. But in that experience, he could no longer do that, and ultimately, among the many other things that he did later in life, he insisted on the creation of an Institute of Peace. The other senator involved here was Spark Matsunaga, a Democrat of Hawaii, who, as a Nisei, a first-generation Japanese American, was interned with other Japanese Americans after the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was at that point already in the Army. Japanese American troops who were serving at the time of Pearl Harbor were immediately disarmed and taken from their units and interned at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, where, as a group, they petitioned FDR for the right to be treated like other soldiers in the U.S. military, and ultimately that petition was heard, and they were formed into the 100th Infantry Battalion, sent to Europe, and they served honorably there. Matsunaga then came home and 40 years later insisted that we needed a specialized organization funded by the government to figure out. We had figured out how to win wars. Now we needed to figure out how to prevent them. So the Institute, we are not an executive agency. Congress had the wisdom to create the Institute as an independent institution. We have an independent board of directors. The Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense sit on our board so that the government always has full view of everything that the Institute is doing. And we work in close partnership with government agencies, often with the military, with embassies overseas. In war zones, we are never part of an embassy. We are never based on a U.S. military facility. We work outside the wire, as the military calls it, but often in coordination with other elements of U.S. foreign policy abroad. I guess I should say thank you for your contributions, by the way, to the Institute, because it's American, it's your tax dollars, well, actually in our case it's your tax cents, that pay for the Institute. Every American on an annual basis pays for our military establishment $1,900 per year. It's the only country that exceeds us in per capita military spending is Saudi Arabia. Second place belongs basically to the Americans and the Israelis, kind of in a tie, about $1,900 a year. Your cost for the U.S. Institute of Peace per year is 10 cents. But we're grateful to have it. I should offer some concrete examples then also of what we do. And some of these would be, for example, that in Colombia, where just 2 years ago we had the government sign a peace accord with the main rebel movement, the FARC in Colombia. We worked on strengthening that peace agreement by building networks of women throughout the country who serve as mediators at local levels for disputes within their communities, but then also as a group formed an organizational voice that could essentially enforce the participation of women and the voices of women in the elaboration of that peace accord. USIP does a lot of research. One of the things we research is peace accords. In the past, and I've forgotten exactly how many years over which we've measured this, it's on the order of 30 to 40 years. If we take together all the peace accords that have been signed in an effort to resolve either interstate or intra-state civil conflicts, we find that half of all peace agreements fail within 5 years. And they basically fail for one of two reasons. Either in elaborating that peace accord, we did not get everybody who was needed into the room. We left somebody out in the hallway who then became a spoiler. And so essentially the peace accord was not inclusive enough. Inclusion is the first principle. And hence the work, for example, in Colombia, which was focused very much on the inclusion of women, the inclusion of Afro-Colombians who tended to be left out, the inclusion of Colombian indigenous communities who also tended to be left out of the formal state or state-organized peacemaking processes. The other reason that peace accords tend to fail is either you left someone out, or that in the negotiations, as everyone sat around the table and came to an agreement, you weren't really dealing with the root causes of the conflict. You were dealing with a kind of a masking issue, an issue that is raised and articulated as, by golly, this is the thing we're fighting about. Let's say, for example, a religious conflict. Well, what we're fighting about is these people are Muslims, these people are Christians, and there's a dispute between these two communities. Very often, what those two things are simply identities that have coalesced around a deeper root of conflict between communities. And if you only deal with that more superficial level, don't get to the root cause. Anybody who's ever done, let's say, family counseling or marriage counseling knows this. This is the first thing your counselor tries to do, is ask, what's the real issue here? One of my counselors used to say, we have the real issues, but the first thing that I hear whenever say a couple or a family comes into the room is, what I hear is the hair in the sink issues. But it's only when you get underneath those to issues of let's say, control, power, respect, and at any rate, those, we are slowly learning how, I say we in this context, I simply mean the global community, slowly learning how to get better at peace agreements. That peace accord in Colombia, we're having a heck of a time getting it implemented, in part because there's been a change of government that is less favorable to the implementation of that accord, in part because frankly, because the United States government also is somewhat unfriendly, is unfriendly to the implementation of a peace accord which was seen as too accommodating to what was a left-wing guerrilla movement. But that implementation sort of process is still underway, and it hasn't failed yet, and so we cross our fingers and work hard. Another place where we're involved is Afghanistan. One of the projects that we have there was simply to work with Afghans to write the first peace curriculum, the first conflict resolution curriculum for a program of conflict resolution studies at universities. We started this with a single university in Kabul. And once we had it up and running and other universities were able to see it, now a total of 6 universities have come to us to ask us to help them implement this curriculum in their programs in Herat, Mazar-i-Sharif, Kandahar in the south. And the Ministry of Higher Education just this year has approved this curriculum for use at every state university nationwide. So you know, peace building is a long-term process, and sometimes you are working on these generational timescales. But we think we're seeing progress there. In Iraq, we've worked over 16 years to build an Iraqi partner organization. It's called Sanad for peace building. Sanad in Arabic means support. So the Support for Peace Building organization in Iraq has now become the premier, the go-to organization, go-to for the government, which now is going to Sanad frequently, asking them, please bring mediators to Mosul, please bring mediators to Tal Afar, please bring mediators to Al-Hawija, and in a number of these communities, notably, for example, in the city of Tikrit, which was Saddam Hussein's hometown, and where we had just a horrific massacre of Shia Muslims during the ISIS war, and the threat of blood vengeance between Sunni and Shia tribes around the Tikrit area. Sanad, with help from the U.S. Institute of Peace, managed to convene tribes and basically get a local peace agreement to avoid blood vengeance, to allow displaced Iraqis to return home. Now, as a result of that agreement and the follow-on implementation in Salahuddin province of Iraq, we've seen, the latest number we have from the Iraqi government is a return of 600,000 displaced Iraqis to their homes. That represents about 16% of the total displaced population in Iraq. So that's a significant advance. The international community pays about $1 billion a year simply to take care of the basic needs of displaced people within Iraq. So you can actually measure a cost savings. This is a point we make when we speak to Congress about the value of the Institute and its work. If people have specific questions, maybe about other places.
And we should, get up and talk a little bit, and then exactly. we'll do the questions.
Yeah, we can. So there are other particulars that we can talk about of the Institute's work.
Okay.
So. I'm taking that one? Is that because I'm supposed to be on the left?
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you in particular for your opening remarks and your very perceptive observations about St. John's, which it didn't take you long, I guess, just from looking at our website. I think you sort of really nailed one, an important aspect of this parish, and it's one of the reasons we all do love it here. And so, as I warned you in advance, the first question I'm going to ask you, and it's a question we're asking of all our speakers in the adult forums this fall, goes to the overall theme, and so of our talks this fall, and that is what is justice, and why and how should we as people of faith become involved in such things, if at all? And we're asking our speakers to answer that in the context of what they do. Please let us know your thoughts on that.
So on the what is justice, I guess I think of that in two parts. There's a kind of a secular, there's a secular civic part, if you like. When anybody who's taken a class, I can't remember whether we were in the same political theory class with Chuck Bites or not. Okay, so we read John Rawls' Theory of Justice, and basically, and Rawls is writing about this. He's making basically a more organized and articulate case, perhaps, but basically articulating that same secular and civic sense of justice that animated the creation of the United States, and that's the notion of justice as fairness. And he goes through this exercise where he basically says, the way that we could build a just society, if this room is to be our society, and we are to very shortly to engage on our life together as a community over there in the next room. First of all, we're going to sit here and decide on what are the just rules for us to to live together as a society. But before we enter upon our life together and go through those doors and discover what place each of us will have in that world in which we will live, we don't know now. We're behind what he called the veil of ignorance. We don't know at this moment what place of privilege or power we will have in that society that we'll share there. So let's make the rules now, not knowing each of us individually whether we're going to be the king or the commander in chief in that society, or whether we're going to be living on the streets at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. He says, under that set of conditions, if we have to sit here and organize our society before we know what our place in it will be, we will do a pretty good job of organizing a just society. So that's the secular notion, and it's articulated in the Declaration of Independence. But then there's actually, you've got it. I liked at the top of your flyer and on the website, at the top of your page, we're quoting Deuteronomy. Justice and only justice you shall pursue, so that you may live and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. In the original Hebrew of this passage, the word being used for justice is tzedek. The Hebrew for this line says tzedek tzedek tirdav, justice you shall do. Now here's a curious thing about that. I love these linguistic issues. I never studied languages in school, but when I got to Peace Corps and had to learn Arabic, suddenly it was a mind opener. Tzedek, the Hebrew word for justice, uses the same root as the word tzedakah, which is the word for charity. And the thing that bent my mind and just rocked me back totally when I discovered this is that tzedakah in Arabic is also the word for charity. And this is you spend time, and I know the engagement of this congregation, by the way, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the conflict in the Holy Land. And when you spend time there, if you arrive there as an Arabic speaker and suddenly you're running around Israel listening to all these people speaking Hebrew, and you say, hey, wait a second, I can almost understand what you're saying, because of the close relations between these two languages. But the fact that the justice spoken of in Deuteronomy is drawn from the same Hebrew root word as the word for charity suggests to us that there is an element of justice which also includes kindness, which would be the word, for example, that the Dalai Lama would choose, were we to ask him warm-heartedness, is the way he puts it. Kindness, warm-heartedness. So there's an element of all of this: charity, kindness. What's the passage from Micah? We are called upon to love justice, perform kindness, and walk humbly with our God. The link is made explicit right there. And so I think there's a secular part, and then there's a spiritual part that crosses the lines of religion, as manifest in that quote.
And as you said, we are a congregation that goes out and does things, and you alluded to our work in the Holy Land. But sometimes I'm sure we all think the problems are so large out there. Are we really making a difference? Certainly, for example, having a new ambulance in Nablus, funding a nurse in Gaza. They do. It would seem they would have to make a difference, but given your experience both at the Institute and as a journalist and being in so many countries over the years, do things like this really make a difference in your experience, or is it just sort of a drop in the bucket? And
yeah, yes, it is. It is just a drop in the bucket, and it does make a difference. It's both at the same time. And the fact that you all are funding, or have funded an ambulance in the city of Nablus that allows the hospital there to stay open and keep working. This is an enormous thing. Yet, of course, also at the same time, in a world of many wars, and let's say, for example, we now have 65 million people, the most ever recorded since we started keeping these numbers. 65 million people around the world displaced by, uprooted by warfare. That's equal to the population of, say, Italy or the United Kingdom. If the world's refugees were a country, they would be the size of a major world country. And so, we look at the scale of that. We say, oh my golly, an ambulance in Nablus is a drop in the bucket. Yes, it's both at the same time. But that engagement, when you're living in Nablus, and this is the thing I first discovered in the Peace Corps, living in a little town in Morocco. And spending 2 years building a vocational school there and teaching Moroccan boys how to fix bicycles and do basic welding and things like this. So the question would come up periodically. People would ask me, they would sort of stop me on the street or and pull me aside and say, I just want to ask you, why are you here? Why did you come? We know that we know something about America and life in America. We know it's better than here. Why did you come from that to this? I'm not sure I ever fully had an answer to that question myself. But I had a core of an answer to that question, which was that well, it matters to us as people, it matters to me as an individual, it matters to my community and my church, that you, as someone who is distant, from me, that your needs be looked after. It matters that we take care of everybody, and that, in the end, is an immensely powerful statement. And by the way, the only people who can make it effectively are the ones in the relatively more powerful position in that relationship. When it's a more powerful community speaking to a less powerful community, a community with privilege speaking to a community without privilege, the expression of connection across the divide it can. I shouldn't say it can only be made effectively. I'm not sure I really believe that, but it is certainly made more powerfully with greater impact and when it is made by the privileged. And yeah, it's hugely effective. It's the only thing that's effective, in fact.
Well, we're running a little bit short on time here, and I have a number of more questions, but I also want to give folks here the chance to ask some questions. So why don't we open it up? And let me remind folks, please don't begin your question until you get a microphone so we can record you for posterity.
Hi, John Ross here. Thank you so much for coming. It's just
sure.
a great gift to us and very provocative and thoughtful. It seems clear that your personal journey was as transformative from a journalist thinking about these things to really acting on behalf of peace, thinking in these broad terms. We can all understand how awful war is. But there's a difference between embracing concepts of justice that make us start to act on those issues, as opposed to say, I just can't deal with it. Mm-hmm. What are some of the foundational things that happened that you came to realize on your personal journey that made you realize that, to embrace justice issues and to act on them? What was that thing that really pushed you?
Well, first of all, it was my parents. My father was a Methodist minister originally my family's from New Jersey. Originally we're from West Virginia, but we moved to New Jersey for my dad to go to seminary, and he wound up serving in the Methodist Church, many Methodist churches in New Jersey. 1967, living in a small town of southern New Jersey, our local community was afflicted by this was the 1960s, it was the time of the Civil Rights Movement, and we were afflicted by a wave of cross burnings by local Ku Klux Klan wannabes, and Dad, just apathy on the part of the white community was too easy, and for the local white elite, which we were kind of on the fringes of, because here's this family of of one of the local ministers. Yet we had just been assigned by the church. We had just arrived, and we were not so much part of that community. I think that made it easier, in a way, for my folks to be among the relatively few members of the white community, who then immediately went to the black churches, the NAACP, and said, how can we help? And of course they had to explain that to their kids. And unfortunately, in the structures of churches are many things. They're communities and congregations, of course, but they're also very large organizations with bureaucratic modes of thinking and whatnot. And the bureaucratic element of the Methodist Church in New Jersey kind of kicked in, and my dad was told that this he wound up helping to lead a march down the main street of Salem, and to insist that the local authorities actually conduct investigations and find out who was burnt. This was after the 20th cross had been burnt, and no arrests had been made, and so the church in Jersey at the time basically said this is, and it started within our congregation. Basically, a portion of the congregation just wasn't ready for for the notions of racial togetherness, and asked for my folks to be removed. And because of the bureaucratic needs of the church, he was removed, and basically ultimately decided to leave the pastoral ministry because he could not do what he felt he needed to. Beyond that, it was simply connection. It was just the connections with people from different places.
So what in your experience can you share with us that would help us to think about when we're holding talks like this, when we're moving out into the community, what are the elements that we can help bring people along on their journey toward understanding justice, embracing it, and acting on it?
I don't know that I have any insight that isn't evident to any of us if we just think and talk about it as carefully as I can already see is done here at St. John's. I guess a couple of things I've noticed are, one is the point that I made a moment ago about the power of the power of both seeking justice but also reconciliation. And these things are tied across lines of of gaps of power and privilege. The effectiveness of the work when it starts from the position of power and privilege being so much faster and greater. A corollary to that, one thing I've noticed is that across a line of conflict, when what we're doing is working across a line of hostility, that the conciliatory act is the more powerful, essentially, the worse the conflict is. After the invasion of Iraq in 2003, I was in Baghdad, and I asked to go to a school, and visited a couple of classrooms, and got introduced by a teacher who said, "This is an American journalist," and I said to the kids, I said, if you have questions about the United States, about America, you see American soldiers in the streets all around you all the time. If you have questions about this that I can help with, I'm happy to answer them. And one girl raised her hand, not with a question, but with with this startling observation. She said, "Well, I found out that Americans have children too." And I asked, "Well, how did you find out about this?" And she said, "Oh, I was talking to some soldiers in the marketplace." And the conversation went on for, took a turn for another minute. And then suddenly, 1 minute later, she's sitting in her seat sobbing aloud. Well, it turns out she didn't meet the soldiers in the marketplace. That had been her lie of the moment when she had been asked the question. She had met these soldiers because they had come into her home and arrested her father. And now she was afraid that because she had spoken about having met Americans in this way, that maybe, now she's spoken about it publicly to another American. I mean, maybe the Americans are going to figure out who she is, and they're going to send the soldiers back, and there's going to be more trouble at home. And I said to her, I said, "No, actually, in the way we think and the way we feel as a community, we would never want to see your father arrested for any unjust reason. B, we would never want retribution against your family because you spoke of it." The measure of her relief, it was extraordinary, and it was out of bounds large in the end to her that she had just simply had this follow-up conversation with an American who wasn't wearing mirrored sunglasses and dressed in body armor and in a helmet and fearful in that way, that you take the helmet off and you have a conversation and you're a real person. And this to her was a revolutionary thing. And that it's that individual, I think we all know this, and this is why I say I can't offer an insight, because we all know it, that we are able to dehumanize other people in the way that we are forced to do, required to do in warfare. We can't have a war, cannot have a war, cannot have an armed conflict with a human opponent whom we see as fully human. The act of dehumanization is a necessary condition for war. So, so in the building of peace, it's the restoring, of course, of our understanding of this person, you know, across the table or across the gap, whatever it is, as simply a person.
That's exactly the revelation that Senator Hatfield had.
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
right,
yes,
right,
exactly. Thank
right.
you. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we are a little bit past our time. Jim, if you can stick around for a few minutes if other people have
sure,
questions, but thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.